Okay, great. Hi everyone. I can't see the room unfortunately, but it's good to be here. Thanks to the conference organizers. Thanks to Rafael, Tamzin, and Tamara for the invitation. I hope it's been a successful and productive conference. In the time I have available, I want to try and do a few things. First, I'll build on some thoughts drawing from my book on democracy and authoritarianism and how we distinguish the one from the other. I want to argue in the course of the talk that that's perhaps not as straightforward as we might imagine. Secondly, I want to explain what I think is happening. Why is authoritarianism on the march? And I'm going to argue that it's because of a situation facing global societies, one marked by heightened systemic risk or cascading crises. And I will explain what I mean by that. Then in the third move, I'll introduce my conception of authoritarian protectionism that I put forward in my 2021 book. And I'll discuss how international relations as a subject matter might speak to these questions of democratization and authoritarianization. And what I mean by this is how the existence of a world of many different societies, the fact of the international, as it's sometimes put in the jargon of the Anglo-American wing of the discipline, affects how we think about the authoritarian threat we face today. And finally, I'll ask where the Russian war on Ukraine leaves the cherished principles of multilateralism and collective security, whether it indeed, as the title of my talk suggests, it is possible to pursue an agenda based on internationalism and collective security in our authoritarian world. These are obviously live questions that I think in a way everyone has an opinion of. And this is because we're increasingly encountering the problem that might be summarized: how can we be democrats in this authoritarian world? Much like societies are adapting to the contagion and pandemic that is COVID-19, are we also learning, to live with authoritarian regression? And how is the interplay between democracy and despotism shaping our politics? So above all, I want to question what I'll call today the externalist fallacy, the belief that authoritarian transformation is simply an external threat democratic societies need to be protected from, and offer an alternative diagnosis, which states broadly that while we may find comfort in the idea we can shield our societies from these allegedly external pressures of authoritarianization, this would actually leave democracies more, not less, exposed to these dynamics. Now, I think a starting point for any consideration of democracy and authoritarianism should be a simple one, and that is that opponents of democracy can often veil their actions in the language of democratization and empowerment. Now, this is arguably more than a simple linguistic maneuver, but perhaps reflects part of the governing practices of many democratic states. After all, the de facto rejection of the universal element of universal human rights was an important feature of the American response to the September 11th terrorist attacks 2 decades ago. Rather than treating it as an appalling criminal action requiring a response based on international criminal law, it was instead framed in Al-Qaeda's terms as an act of war. This in turn served to justify acts which violated the rule of law system: illegal wars of aggression, torture, kidnap, sometimes discussed under the euphemism of extraordinary rendition, of course, and state assassination policies became part of the structural DNA of US foreign policy. Now, that is a consummate example of what the post-colonial scholar Partha Chatterjee has described in erudite terms as the power to declare the exception. Imperialism in the modern world, with an important exception, which I'll come on to later, does not tend to take the form of classical imperialist conquests for territory. Instead, powerful states pursue imperialist logics through informal means of hard power projection, compelling other states and societies to change their behavior. And this can often involve exempting themselves, i.e., in Chatterjee's terms, declaring the exception from principles of human rights and the rules-based order that these self-same states tend to declare their nominal support for. Against this backdrop of inconsistency and values not adhered to, defining what exactly we mean by democracy can be a challenge. What does it mean for a people to enjoy sovereignty, the right to rule oneself? This is a particular issue in a world of many societies and many peoples, because a notion of pure sovereignty, untrammeled power for one particular people, is dangerous in such a world. It must logically infringe on the sovereignty of others. Notions of a pure people in ethnic terms are even more dangerous, involving the alienation, persecution, and perhaps genocidal elimination of minorities that are not seen as legitimate. In other words, it must be part of the functioning of democracy that it recognizes sovereignty is shared and overlapping, that there are many peoples, many societies, and therefore a plurality of democracies. This is not the end of the matter, though, because it follows from this that there's a further contradiction of democracy, and that lies in the fact that there can be mutually antagonistic democratic demands that both claim a democratic mandate, a clash of democracies, if you like. In my book published last year, I start by making a case for a working definition of democracy. I define democracy as the coexistence of formalized systems of representation and substantive empowerment. The former refers to the rules-based procedures and institutions that allow democracy to function. The latter denotes the conditions, which may be more sociological and indeed economic, necessary for citizens to determine their life choices and have a say over institutions that are responsive to their demands. Now, this is a normative conception of democracy, which depicts it as we would like it to be, not as it is necessarily practiced in specific states. And this opens up a space, I think, to critique the status quo. It has a quiet radical potential as it challenges the existence of practices and conditions that disempower citizens, diminishing their ability to exercise meaningful control over their everyday lives. For instance, the terrible effects of the cost of living crisis in Europe or the unfolding hunger crisis in many African states hugely undermines the substantive capacity of citizens to live the lives that they choose to live, placing them at the mercy of forces that they cannot control and are therefore, objectively speaking, undemocratic in their core nature. So where does this leave the question of authoritarianism and how we should define it? On the one hand, we might well use this conception of democracy to uncover the enduring authoritarian practices and structures that exist in the nature of the economic structure, capitalism, that predominates, and the often problematic relationship it has to the institutions of democracy. On the other hand, while this is no doubt helpful and useful, I prefer to focus on political authoritarianism and define it as a relational category, i.e. one that should be understood in opposition to the normative definition of democracy. And I argue that authoritarianism should be seen as a conscious attack on formal and substantive dimensions of democracy. Authoritarianism is defined by its attack on these elements. Authoritarians seek to create or have created systems based on the monopolization of power by an oligarchic elite or individual, usually combining political and economic interests. So this simple relational definition means that where authoritarianism advances, democracy must decline, and vice versa. So this also goes beyond the failings of contemporary democracy, as it requires a conscious attempt by forces hostile to democratic functioning to manipulate institutions around their interests in some kind of authoritarian offensive. Now, today it has become commonplace, perhaps even glib, to recognize that democracy has become very fragile. We can observe that the 21st century and its unfolding traumas and crises present a profound challenge to the basic principles of self-governing societies. There are crises everywhere, they overlap, they interpenetrate with one another, and they bring greater political instability, convulsion, and breakdown. From the COVID-19 pandemic, rising inequality, falling economic growth, the proliferation of violent conflict, including the return, of course, of warfare to Europe, and multiple threats facing our environment, from the great extinction to rapidly rising temperatures, we are living in an epoch of growing social crisis. In the opening pages of Legitimation Crisis, the German sociologist Jürgen Habermas talks about the definition of a crisis as a moment of breakdown in which individuals feel a breach in a normal pattern of life by some kind of external force disrupting and throwing into question their ability to control the forces that impact their everyday life. They may seek to escape the crisis in one way or another in order to restore some sense of control they have over their life. Habermas argued, correctly in my view, that a crisis therefore necessarily involves making moral and normative claims about a good society that is not in a crisis, yet also at the same time cannot be a mere subjective belief. A society does not enter into a crisis simply because some people think that it has done so. In other words, it is this combination, a sense that something is wrong and objective reasons for believing that this sense is justified by a change or breakdown in normal conditions, that may define the conception of a crisis. Those of us that approach things from a historical perspective might also be inclined to observe the parallels that exist with other extended periods of crisis in world history. For example, those deep and long crises that beset 14th century Europe, a time marked in particular by the terrible toll of the Black Death, or the global crisis of the 17th century, as a weather-induced depression in agricultural output led to famines all over the world. Despite the toll these crises took on society, they also stimulated change as groups innovated institutionally and economically in the face of the difficulties that they encountered. Like these earlier periods of disruption and transformation, we are also living in a period marked by a dramatic heightening of systemic risk. That is, the proliferation of risks that are highly complex, involve considerable uncertainty, and see cascading effects develop as a crisis within one system, like our economy, leads to further crises in other systems, like our political governance or our environment. In this sense, we don't, for the most part, have a problem in delineating the growing cascading crises of our era. What's more, we also know that these crises will only intensify and accelerate in their speed and ferocity. Due to the scientific breakthroughs of the modern era, we are alert to the earthly drivers of these changes. Science has forewarned us of the great dangers ahead. We know that the relationship between the human species and planet Earth is under great stress, and we can model some of the likely contours and outcomes of the events that lie ahead. As the concept of the Anthropocene teaches us, if the human species were to become extinct tomorrow, we would have already left a permanent, enduring mark on Earth, one quite unlike that of any earlier, now extinct species. So we are both uniquely cognizant of the dangers that we face and have the capacity in principle to utilize technology and transform social systems in order to adapt and perhaps avert the worst of the dangers ahead. Now, many civilizations in the era of sedentary agriculture and after have experienced long crises, usually due to changing weather patterns and declining agricultural output, producing an intensification of class and interstate conflict over resources. In the industrial and post-industrial era in which we live, the long crises change its nature. It is driven by the ecological costs of production for abundance, the need to produce limitless growth. Nonetheless, we can still use a similar metric of analysis to think about how the human world is being profoundly disruptive and how it might be brought back into some kind of equilibrium. Other long crises in world history have been defined through three metrics. First, as I've suggested, environmental conditions and their social effects. Second, the productive capacity of the economic system and its ability to generate surpluses and the extent of the inequality entailed by how they're distributed. And third, the governance arrangements within and between societies, including their propensity for war and the ideas they use to garner legitimacy. Applied to the current conjuncture in world politics, each of these dimensions points to a human order facing severe crisis and challenge. We are only at the beginning of the changes set to be unleashed by man-made climate change. Economic inequality globally is going through a huge acceleration, with a very small elite at the top enjoying lifestyles and wealth unimaginable to the great majority. And our politics, governance, and security arrangements have been breaking, dramatically so this year, with the Russian war on Ukraine. Now, one way of thinking about the political fallout from these turbulent crises we are experiencing is through what I call in the book the rising importance of the claim to protection. Politics today sees a decline in the importance of egoistic individualism. Instead, the making of collective claims to protection is back. The idea in particular that the shielding of the community or society from the growing crescendo of crises is necessary. In this context of disruption, political elites in many states globally have increasingly adapted their discourses. We can observe a decline in the kind of hardline meritocratic discourses associated with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, which of course had a tremendous influence internationally, notably in Central and Eastern Europe. Thatcher and Reagan both found the idea of a state that protects the socio-economic welfare of its people to be, for the most part, offensive. They rejected the social welfare safety net, seeing the small state as the basis for the incentivization of hard work. A fearless country, to paraphrase Thatcher, was built on the back of fearless people. And that fearlessness would be pursued by individuals that prioritized their own interests, not those of others. Her nationalism, which was certainly a very strong presence in her thinking, was cast in terms that rejected notions of collective solidarity or the idea that individual members of the nation had a responsibility to support one another. Instead, a great nation, in her imagery, was built by unleashing market forces. In their recent book, The Upswing, Robert Putnam and Shailene Romney Garrett focus in on the American side of this story. They tell a narrative of how a nation lost its way. They present an evocative outline of a conflict between two alternative ways of thinking about the wider world. A communitarian we on the one hand, and an egotistical I on the other. They argue the former, the solidaristic politics of we the people, had the upper hand from the start of the 20th century until the 1960s and 1970s. It was then, perhaps surprisingly for people at the time, displaced by a new politics of hyper-individualism. Today, America lives with the consequences of what they call a long downswing, hollowed out infrastructure, decaying industries, pollution and climate emissions, massive economic inequality, and entrenched, institutionalized racial injustices. Now, they admit at one point in the book, and I'm quoting here, in today's Trump world, what counts as conservatism is much in turmoil. But they argue for the half century between 1960 and 2016, conservatism shifted starkly away from the solidarity and compassion of the 1950s Republicans. Now, I read this after writing my own book, but I found it interesting how it both parallels some of my arguments, but has a very different position, focusing trenchantly on the rise of the I, egoistic individualism, and the decline of conceptions of communitarianism and compassion. While lots of the story they tell is very persuasive, here I want to question whether Putnam has the we and I dichotomy correct. Their seeming uncertainty of what to make of the post-Trump Republican Party illustrates, I think, the multiple ways that the we can be defined. After all, Trump persistently utilized collectivist discourses, but in a highly ethno-nationalistic form. He condemned the trade liberalization agenda, especially in relation to the effects of Chinese competition on American jobs, as a conspiracy of an out-of-touch metropolitan elite against ordinary blue and white-collar Americans. He utilized, of course, extreme racist discourses condemning Latin American migrants as criminals and rapists. He attacked the globalism of Washington and said he would stand up for America again, pursuing a zero-sum economic and foreign policy that prioritized the national interest. In short, this did have a very strong notion of the we. It was just one lacking any progressive content. And this belies, I think, a wider change in elite politics globally that we can uncover in other international case studies. As disenchantment with the effects of marketization sets in, elite politics has to reposition itself, abandoning the claim that individual hard work is sufficient to live a prosperous life, and instead promoting an alternative claim that the state and society should protect. And in my book, I call this authoritarian protectionism. It involves a few steps. Firstly, an ethnically exclusionary view of the nation, something that in most instances will be simultaneously framed in patriarchal terms using traditional social codes. Secondly, the articulation of this group, the ethno-nation, as having interests fundamentally distinct to those not included in the identity. And on some occasions, there's also an additional step, some kind of civilizational crisis or reckoning that means the goals of the people are urgent and the risks existential if they fail to rise to them. Now, once this discursive picture is in place, and as other scholars of authoritarianism have argued, people who believe that their interests are fundamentally at risk may well support attacks on democracy, the rule of law, and human rights in order to protect themselves against the threats that have allegedly been railed against their interests, such as globalists, ethnic minorities, or immigrants. And this helps us make sense of the transformation seen in conservative politics in the US, but also other countries, where the ethno-national people have become the key agent of political discourses, something we see to different degrees in Modi's India, Xi Jinping's China, Bolsonaro's Brazil, or Poland, Britain, and Hungary, where we also have rule of law crises. The American case provides an indication of how human rights and social liberal values can be discarded in the name of a particular depiction of the rights and freedoms of true Americans. And this brings me finally to the question of the Russian war on Ukraine. But by getting there via this route, via America and the rest of the world, it was a deliberate choice in my presentation, because I don't believe the starting point for any analysis of what's happening in Ukraine lies in a domestic analysis of Russian politics. We have to think in terms of the international, the multiple ways that societies are interconnected to make sense of what is happening. Now, Putin's arguments can be slotted very easily into the framework of authoritarian protectionism I've outlined. In his now infamous essay of the summer of 2021, titled "On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians," he argued that the two communities are, in his words, one people, a single whole. And in frequently Orwellian terms, especially when read in the context of the subsequent invasion, the essay assimilated Ukrainian identity into a monolithic pan-Russian one. He decreed that Ukraine does not have a legitimate existence as an entity independent of and separate from Russia. Ukrainian statehood was held to be an invention of the Soviet Union and its localization policy. This imposed a Ukrainian identity on those that, for Putin, or according to Putin's argument, would have preferred to remain Russian, and created a dangerous time bomb that, he says, exploded with the fall of the Soviet Union. For Putin, the loss of the Communist Party meant that there was no force that was able to uphold the unity of Ukrainians and Russians. And so, in his warped worldview, the invasion corrects this error and restores harmony. So any assertion of Ukraine's right to independent selfhood can only be indicative for Putin of some kind of malformity, a claim that has some parallels to Xi Jinping's campaign of cultural genocide against the Uyghur people in Xinjiang. Dangerous and foreign threats are held to require cleansing, a kind of violent assimilation. Nonetheless, Putin's willingness to abandon any pretense of legal justification and utilize open imperialist arguments goes further than most of his global co-thinkers. Putin has compared his war to the conquests of Peter the Great just a few weeks ago, and in doing so, he effectively discarded the UN Charter's touchstone principles of sovereign equality and territorial integrity. So interestingly, this is not the power to declare the exception that Partha Chatterjee talks about, and I mentioned at the start of this lecture. Indeed, Kremlin-aligned outriders have made similarly openly imperialist and even genocidal statements. In one example, from the state media agency RIA Novosti, they called for an op-ed was written and published by the media agency that called for a campaign of repression and liquidation in Ukraine under the absolute control of the Russian state, explicitly rejecting any notion of Ukrainian sovereignty. This denazification would, they said, inevitably also be de-Ukrainianization, adding that Ukraine cannot be kept as a title of any fully denazified state entity on the territory liberated from the Nazi regime. So this raw fascism, veiled in anti-Nazi discourse, now defines the Kremlin's view of the world. So finally then, how do these crises relate to the sociological context I've also established, the social and ecological and structural conditions of crises we see today? First, because we are seeing an intensification of conflicts over distribution, which do not necessarily lead to effective redistributional solutions, societies are experiencing low to stagnant growth. We'll likely see intensifying conflicts over how the gains from economic growth are distributed. And as markets become more dependent on states to intervene to generate growth, they also create opportunities for the kind of kleptocratic political economy associated with the new authoritarianism. Secondly, geopolitical and social crises are also themselves reflective of the ecological terrain, as we can see in how the Russian war on Ukraine has hit and impacted the global food supply and has its own extractive logic in relation to the energy industries. Climate change will act, and indeed is already acting, to further intensify conflicts over distribution, with societies that are dependent on subsistent agriculture particularly exposed to these effects, of course. In these situations, growing beggar thy neighbor dynamics will appear. We can hypothesize that there will be more importance given to what I've called the claim to protection. So against this structural backdrop, it will be hard to avoid an ongoing semi-permanent quasi-conflict with authoritarian protectionists. And this poses the need to construct an alternative, inclusive claim to protection based on mutual solidarity, democratic governance, and fundamental rights. Finally, how does recognizing international relations or the international shape how we understand the dynamics of rising authoritarianism? We firstly have to start by recognizing we live in a world of many societies, and as such, the process of democratization will always be uneven, conflictual, and complex. It is shaped above all by the multiple ways in which societies interact and interlock with one another. And one fallacy that has emerged, particularly in the response to the Russian war on Ukraine, is the view that the danger of authoritarianism is merely an external matter of international relations alone. According to this logic, the world is divided between democratic, non-democratic, semi-democratic, or semi-authoritarian regimes. And while this may be more or less true as a descriptive statement, it becomes problematic once we assume that states cannot move between these categories and start to imagine that the authoritarian danger is purely a geopolitical phenomenon, for example, one marked by the threat of Russia as an autocratic and militarist expansionist state. A similar point can, of course, be made about China too, and the way that it has broken up democracy in Hong Kong and threatened Taiwan, a war against Taiwan being, of course, a formidably harder prospect. Now, of course, we should be clear that these extremely authoritarian states do threaten the rule of law system. But if there were a case that the threat to democracy, or if it was the case that the threat to democracy was a purely geopolitical phenomenon, there would be little in the way of a substantive, genuine threat to democratic societies themselves, beyond the risk of, which of course is serious, geopolitical miscalculation and war. There would not be nonetheless an internal danger to these societies. But of course, that simply isn't the case. Long-standing stable democracies like India and my country, the United Kingdom, or relatively young ones like Poland and Hungary are experiencing the dangers of authoritarian regression. It is, in other words, a global phenomenon. The conclusion of this returns to our original question then, how to be a democrat in an authoritarian world, which requires, I think, the persistent pursuit of several key principles. While military alliances like NATO are important in the face of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, they have to be calibrated towards a defensive posture that prioritizes the protection of the rule of law system. We have to be mindful of the danger that defensive alliances can be misinterpreted as offensive ones and rule out wars of aggression like those in Iraq and Afghanistan. Hypocrisy, declaring an exception from the rules that you insist others follows, has undermined the soft power of the United States, Britain, and other nations, and such actions must be finally disregarded. Key to avoiding this is a trenchant commitment to the alternative, and that's the principle of collective security. For whereas bloc-based security assumes specific states and military alliances have a primacy of obligation to their allies, collective security holds that all states have a mutual obligation to ensure one another's safety. It seeks to advance common interests that address the cascading crises of our time, whether that's war and violence, economic insecurity, and corruption and authoritarianism. And while collective security might be accused of naivety, it is arguably a pragmatic doctrine. It recognizes the pursuit of collective security may involve the use of force and just wars, but it places legal and moral limits on how that force is used. It challenges the zero-sum conception of deterrence and promotes a positive-sum agenda that I would argue is consistent with the substantive social needs we face in the 21st century, as states have to cooperate if we are to have any hope of equitable, sustainable development. This in turn involves an expansive conception of the we that prioritizes international solidarity and multilateralism between states and peoples, supporting the building of many democracies and recognizing the shared character of sovereignty and the need to cooperate with one another. Lastly, and this is something we need to talk about more, there is a need to resolutely defend certainly the formal institutions of the rule of law system from corrosion, but that has to be combined with social movements and civic mobilization that keep those institutions honest. And this mobilization can in turn pursue policies that are progressively redistributive, rebalancing society in favor of the economic majority and addressing runaway inequality. In other words, to return to where we started, we have to work to ensure not only formal democracy endures, but it becomes capable of delivering substantively democratic outcomes. This, in the end, is the only way to protect and extend the democratic experiment.
Thank you, Luc. I don't know whether you could hear the applause or see the room at all. Thank you very much for your very enlightening talk from several vantage points and putting the crisis of democracy in a broader perspective and in historical context. We have time for questions. And we would like those of you who have any questions to come here and ask.
Yes, because that way Hugh will be able to hear.
Hugh will be able to hear.
And if you want to come down, do that. But in the meantime, I'll read a question that's in the chat. I hope you can hear me, Luc.
Yeah, I can.
There's a question here in the chat. It's from Anna. In democracies, there could also be authoritarian decisions as to block Russians' media in EU. What do you think about the kind of decisions related to collective security or freedom restrictions?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think the underlying assumption of your question is the right one, that democracies can behave in reactionary ways. We've seen that a lot in the history of neoliberalism that I talked about in the last 40 years, that was permanently combined an economic Austerian agenda that undermined substantive democratic outcomes with often illiberal and coercive policies, whether that's towards the LGBT plus community or other minorities and immigrants and so on. We've seen this on countless occasions. I think there is I think the question of the banning of Russia today is a difficult one. I'm not sure exactly what I think about it myself. In principle, I think that the focus on propaganda and disinformation can be back to front, i.e. it can focus on the question of the distribution of propaganda and disinformation and ethnic nationalism, rather than focusing on why individuals and groups are receptive to that propaganda. And a civil liberties response would start, I think, in most instances, from saying that people should be free to disseminate abhorrent ideas but you have a campaign in society to challenge and question those ideas, and it's not the place of the state to legislate against them. Nonetheless, I mean, I do wonder whether Russia today, as a Kremlin agent, does cross the line. And I think that that's a defensible position because of the extremity of the narratives that have emanated from the Kremlin before and during the course of this crisis. The rejection, as I said, of touchstone principles of the UN Charter, the advancing of openly imperialist and genocidal arguments. Does that cross a line in which democratic societies have a right to say, well, actually, we don't want this on our television screens? I think it's a difficult question, but I can see both sides.
Anyone in the room have a question that they wanted to perhaps come up and ask? Dave, do you want to come down so that we can hear? And then Martin, you can go after Dave. Luke, we're just having someone come down here so that they can hear you, or you can hear them. One of the two. Thanks, Dave. You can just talk into here and he can hear you. And he can see you here.
Oh, okay, good. Luke, hello, thanks very much for that. I'm David Humphreys from the Open University of Milton Keynes. Thanks for an excellent tour de force. I've just spent the last half hour busy writing copiously in my notebook. I'm interested in environmental politics and environmental policy, so I'd like to sort of ask you to touch upon a theme that you mentioned, namely climate change and environmental degradation. And I'm just thinking that to a large degree, the crisis of democracy today is that there is nothing in liberal democratic theory, and certainly not the practice of liberal democracies, that we will elect green governments that will safeguard the biological future and integrity of the planet. On the contrary, we seem to be electing governments that will perpetuate and consolidate capitalism and resource exploitation. So I'm just wondering if you've got any reflections on that. And in asking that question, I hasten to add that I have no easy answers. And I've done a lot of thinking on this about how we, is there an incompatibility with democracy? And, might an environmentally sustainable governance sort of look like one that is sort of not democratic, more perhaps a sort of eco-authoritarian form of governance that can ensure long-term environmental sustainability without adhering to liberal democratic principles. So that's I guess a sort of question, an existential question about the future viability of liberal democracy in the Anthropocene and how we are going to stop planetary heating throughout the 21st century. Thanks again for a great lecture. Thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thanks so much. Yeah, a brilliant question, in a way, the question of our time. I agree, I think in part with on the one hand, I agree in part with the assumption that the environmental crisis is indicative of a democratic crisis, i.e. a problem of democratic politics. Can we get populations to move? So on the one hand, we see that populations increasingly have a massive resonance and understanding of the scale of environmental threat that we are facing. We obviously, over the last few days, have broken, you might have been in Athens, but back here in the UK, we've broken the temperature record by several degrees C. I mean, the environmental crisis is happening. We've had terrible fires in London. The fire brigade in London and nationally described it as the worst days that they've experienced in terms of demand for their services since the Second World War. So even in Northwestern Europe, the climate change is happening, and there's massive support in the population, in abstract, to act. I think where it becomes a difficult democratic question is there's a potential difference between that abstract commitment to act and the willingness of people to experience concrete changes in their everyday life. Now, you also raised that is there an issue of democratic theory here as well? Does political theory offer any answers? I mean, I'm just sort of thinking, perhaps riffing off my favorite science fiction author, Kim Stanley Robinson, in his book, The Ministry of the Future, that some people in the room might have read. And I think you could, if you think about some of the arguments in that book, which basically sets up an institution that its raison d'etre is to protect the interests of future generations. You could argue that constitutional theory does offer some answers on the environment, i.e. we could start to talk about environmental rights that need to be constitutionalized because political systems have a responsibility not just to those that are electing them at a particular election, but to the well-being of future generations and planet Earth. And I think there's quite a lot of work along those lines going on amongst environmentalists that I would like to see incorporated in new democratic arrangements that commit states constitutionally to sustainable development.
That's great. Thanks for that answer, Luke. Thank you very much indeed.
Hello, my name is Marcin. I'm from Poland. I have two questions, one more general and one more particular. And my question is, can you see any chance to reverse the growth of social inequalities? And more specific, what did you have any hopes about the leveling up agenda in Britain, for example? That's it. Thank you.
So I want to try and give an optimistic answer. I think the levelling up agenda, to take the first question, to take the questions in reverse order, I think the levelling up agenda is really interesting because of the changes that it tells you about in centre-right politics. So as I mentioned in the talk, I can develop now. I mean, in the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government was ideologically opposed to the concept of levelling up. They believed that individuals, through their own hard work, would get what they deserve. So the idea of redistributing wealth from wealthy regions to poorer ones was completely antithetical to her government's entire agenda and its underlying political philosophy. The fact that in 2019, the UK Conservative government won a very large majority, in part through an illiberal Brexit agenda that was very chauvinistic and nationalistic, but combined very cleverly with this commitment to address regional inequalities. That tells us something about the transformation of conservative ideology, because what's going on there is, whereas Thatcher believed that an individual got what they deserved through their own hard work, how much work they put in would be reflected in how much they got out. The Conservative government today makes a different argument. Essentially, it is, if you vote for us, you will economically benefit from our agenda. So there was the term levelling up was coded in a way to refer to pork, what the Americans call pork barrel politics. Like you vote this Republican senator in, and he will get you federal government money to your area. So it was a different style of political vocabulary and argumentation. And in terms of actually addressing levelling up in a substantive way, I mean, I'm afraid you can forget it. I mean, left behind regions in the UK are now getting less money than they got under the old European funding regime. The one the UK government has replaced it with doesn't match EU funding. They do have some other funds that are tailor government spending towards areas that voted conservative, but they're not substantial. And the reason is that you can't, if you're serious about regional inequality, address it without simultaneously addressing individual inequality. So you have to do both. You have to redistribute on the basis of incomes and redistribute on the basis of geographies. I think there is definitely a way for progressives to intervene here, to argue that we can do both, that the interests of inner city urban areas are not counterposed to rural impoverished areas. but then that both have high levels of inequality and injustice and socioeconomic injustice that need to be addressed. And so, yeah, I think, but the two have to go hand in hand. And some of the arguments that are going on, not just in the UK and US, but across Europe, of course, around the Green New Deal, linking environmental justice to social injustice and talking about democratic participation, do point in the right direction. Of course, the background to all of those debates, the inequality is continually rising. So at the moment, we're moving in the wrong direction and not the right one.
Thank you very much.
Okay, do we have any more questions from the room? Not, can I have one more question, Luke? It concerns this, the extent to which the rise of protective authoritarianism may have stolen some show from the left, right? Previously, you could think of neoliberal authoritarianism exemplified by Trump, for instance, and then the left response would be to highlight protectionism. On the other hand, you have developments like the one you mentioned in Poland with the right-wing ethno-nationalist Law and Justice Party expanding the welfare state, providing a whole range of benefits, being really quite protectionist. What is the short-term, well, not short-term, what is the electoral strategy for left-wing parties, particularly in a country like Poland, where the electorate tends to be, well, less internationalist in its concerns? I mean, you highlighted many of the important principles that the left has to adhere to, but what is to be done in a more traditional country where this protectionist agenda is taken care of to a significant extent by the right? Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with your analysis. I think the new authoritarian protectionists have triangulated very cleverly traditional left issues on social security, social welfare politics, with chauvinist nationalism in a way that many voters find very compelling all over the world. I remember having dinner a few years ago with some colleagues and someone from Civic Platform that Rafał will know is the neoliberal centre-right party in Poland, and he thought that Law and Justice is pretty minimal social security policy by Western European standards was the height of socialism. I mean, that it was a completely mad economic policy. And I was trying to say to him that, I mean, in Germany, in the United Kingdom, I mean, we have always had like similar child benefit systems. We've had them for 60 or 70 years. And the neoliberals that in a way had such tremendous influence in Central and Eastern Europe after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Thatcher's government never touched the child benefit in the UK. It seems completely bizarre to me that the Polish centre-right got themselves into a position of opposing such a policy and revealing in terms of how they lost that part of the electorate. I do agree with the second point that you made too, that I think this is a challenging issue. The issue of the socioeconomic side is straightforward for the left. Where it becomes challenging, obviously, is trying to combine that with pushing back against those culture war issues where public opinion often doesn't align with the politics of the left. And I don't think there's any straightforward way of doing this, really, except maybe strategically. Certainly not. I don't think there's any hope in giving up on pro-human rights, pro-cosmopolitan internationalism politics to try to adapt to the authoritarian far right. That way madness lies. So I think but we can be strategic in what policies that we give particular emphasis to, while remaining committed to a wider human rights, pro-immigration, pro-social, pro-political justice agenda.
Thanks a lot, Luke. Are there any questions? Somebody raised, so the last question. let me read.
May I?
In democracies, there could also be no, that's the.
I'm raising my hand, Sir Lokiv.
It's a question from Ernesto. Yeah, raised hand here.
Yeah, good morning and greetings from Ottawa, Canada. Thank you for your speech, Dr. Luke. And just a brief reaction, briefly react on the China's role in the new power struggle and everything. Can you just briefly introduce China's role on this regard, please?
Yeah, well, yes, that's a huge question. So I can direct you to a longer analysis to the book, because I think what's in a way what's interesting is when 7 or 8 years ago, people were talking about authoritarian regression in liberal democratic societies, and that was the emphasis. We could see that happening in Europe. We could see the emergence of it in the United States, of course, explosively in the 2016 presidential election. So that was the emphasis. I think going on alongside that was a very interesting development and very dangerous development within China itself. And that was an example of a kind of a racial capitalist politics, a racialized capitalism emerging, which drew on many of the same discourses that I call authoritarian protectionism, but was an example of power centralization within a non-democratic state and increasingly personalized dictatorship created around Xi Jinping that drew very heavily on Han Chinese ethnic nationalism. And that has, of course, justified his policies towards the Uyghur people in Xinjiang in particular, but also a brutal crackdown on political freedom in Hong Kong too, and growing bellicose threats to Taiwan. Where I would guess, so that of course is well known, and where I would sort of ask a question or is that around the Russia-China alliance, I think is a very interesting one. At the moment, the Chinese Communist Party regime is very careful to position its territorial claims, for example, most importantly on Taiwan, but also in the South China Sea, in terms that are compatible with international law. That doesn't make them compatible with international law, but the discourse draws on the principles of self-determination, territorial integrity, and China's historic support for non-intervention. Now, I think in that sense, Putin's war on Ukraine is really disruptive and problematic for the China view of the world, because it's involved these open rejections of principles of territorial integrity and sovereign equality that are part of the foundation of the United Nations itself, and it just introduces an awful lot of chaos and disruption that the Chinese regime would like not to see. And then, of course, you have the other, I think, last to mention, fault line domestically for the Chinese administration, which is really exposing the brittleness potentially of the system, maybe even its vulnerability and fragility, even though it's such a long-term stable dictatorship. And that's the commitment to COVID-19, the zero COVID policy that has left them very isolated, not only internationally, but also in the rest of Asia. And if you look at the figures for Chinese economic growth this year, it's really stagnant. So it's really starting to take those shutdowns, really starting to hit the Chinese economy. So I think those are some, that's not an answer, but I think those are some of the key issues and fault lines and trajectories as I see them.
Thank you, Luke.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we need to bring this session to a close. Thank you, Luke, for this very illuminating talk and for fantastic answers to the questions. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for the invitation, Raphael. Good to see you again. See you in London.
See you in London. Take care.